Hey, check it out. I'm at this cemetery. Got some statues behind me. They also have this windmill that's been built, I think in 1850, somewhere around then. It has some interesting structure to it, some grid patterns. Also thought I'd talk to you about some stuff about death, things I learned about that, the afterlife. Kind of been traumatized by death and that sort of thing. It's always bothered me. I've always thought about it. And then one day I realized, you know, if I'm feeling like I'm nothing, I might as well become the best nothing that I can ever be. So I started relating myself to nothing and the emptiness and the space, and I realized that space is connected to everything. Space has no limits. Space is dimensionless in a sense. It's the thing that's inside of everything. And when you understand what space really is, start realizing that there's something going on. There's this transcendence of understanding that happens inside your mind. When you realize that this is just a shell, this design is just a lens that's projecting something else, something, an aspect of space that exists everywhere, okay? So I have this understanding, and I want to help you, anybody who's out there kind of struggling with the concept of death and becoming nothing. You have to realize something, that what you are isn't what you think you are. What you are is something much greater, something much deeper and difficult to understand on your own, okay? It's possible, but it's possible to understand it on your own, and of course everybody has to understand it on their own. But for me, I didn't want to hear what other people thought or believed, right? So I know this is going to be hard for some people because they don't want to be told stuff. They want to think for themselves and discover things for themselves, and that's cool. I respect that, and I think everybody should do that. So that's kind of one thing I struggle with, is like, how do I fit in knowing that other people are like me and they don't want to be told how to think or how to believe and that sort of thing. So I just want to show you something. I just want to leave my signal, leave a message, leave some trace of the piece, trace of the puzzle, right? Some clues as how to move forward, how to look or notice stuff, right? We have all this history, this past in our world, recorded, designed in structures, right? It gives us a path, it gives us things to step on, to move across, to find things, to discover other angles and sides of ourselves that we hadn't seen before, okay? We're all connected. And this, what I'm doing right now, is just one part of it. One part of it, one small part of it. Hopefully it'll become larger. Hopefully I'll be able to connect different things together, different people, different concepts. We could build something greater together. So I know if I went through it, a lot of other people probably are going through it, being traumatized by the thought of becoming nothing and that sort of thing, just disappearing, boom, nothing. That's scary. I think that's probably the most scary thing anybody has to face, alright? Now, I was brought up an atheist, basically. No religion or anything like that. No, nothing like that. I don't really know too much about religion and that sort of thing. So I've had to kind of think about stuff on my own, in my own way, just trying to figure out what exactly this reality is showing me. And reality shows you stuff. It puts it right in your face and makes you have to face it. Even all the things that create fear inside you. It's always there. And death is probably the biggest one, facing you, staring you in the face. And so like one day, I went through a long process of feeling like nothing. feeling empty, invisible, that sort of thing. No voice, nothing to say, no one to talk to, that sort of thing. And then one day I was just like, you know what? If I feel this way for so long and I've basically become nothing, then, I'm going to be the best nothing that I could ever be. I'm going to be the best non-existent sort of thing ever, all right? I flipped it. I was like, instead of trying not to become nothing, I was like, I'm just going to welcome it and become basically nothing, okay? And so from that point on, I started identifying myself as nothing, as just non-existent. Like, I'm not even living in a way. Like, it's hard to explain to someone who hasn't gone through that or hasn't, flipped a switch inside their mind about who they are, what the self is, what your identity is, what makes you who you are. You start thinking, what is this? The way you act, you could act any way you want. So, like, what does that make you? Like, just because you act a certain way, does that make you more or less of a person? Right? So, there are these lines in life, pathways, ways of being, ways of acting. They create sense of yourself, feeling. When two sides rub together, it creates a friction, creates this texture that adds to your life, makes you experience something, right? A sense. We have all these different types of senses that create a higher consciousness. So we have all these senses, our touch, our feeling, our eyesight, our visual side of things, our taste, our hearing, all these senses cross together, creating this unified form of existing that raises our conscious awareness of what's going on, where we are, what's happening, that sort of thing. And I realized that's all it is. Everything's just creating sense. Even the grass, even the stone, as hard as it may be to believe that, there's all these different processes, things cycling around something, creating a unit, creating something that could be conceptualized in some level, some dimension. So even if you die, even if things are over, things continue to create sense. Now, something else that I realized is that this body that we have, it's creating conscious, this body that we have is creating an emergence of conscious. Like, what we believe is ourself is only existent inside this design that has been built. And every day you're viewing through this lens. But what is viewing it from behind that lens? Okay? What I feel is we're all the same person or the same being. We're just filtered through different lenses. This light, this ray of light is shining across an array of lenses, okay, or designs, and it's splitting the light up into different spectrums, different sections of, wavelengths, okay? And we're all viewing from our own perspective, our life, our sense of being, okay? And the universe this whole design tries to make sense of what everything is, what the whole universe is doing, okay? it's all alive in one form or another. We have these skeletons, this past, and it's a structure that we build from, that we recycle. It's this gradient from one side to the other, this transition, and you bounce back and forth to create the sense of being, this sense of life, okay? You have this stillness and you have this constant moving, and there's a balance happening between that all the time, okay? Now, these two sides exist everywhere throughout the universe. I know it because I see it. I sense it. You know, I'm one with it. I realize it. I understand it because I can identify it everywhere. You have to realize that our brain manifests our understanding of this reality, and a lot of it is just belief, right? Stuff you can't really prove or you know, put into a unit of a measurement, right? I mean, you can, and that's what we're doing. We're creating all these measuring sticks, these units, these categorizations, these specializations, these lines, in order to form a structure that makes our reality consistent, that makes it a continuation of something, right? So it's in our human nature, in all of nature. It's a quality that just exists. It's not just a part of human consciousness. It's a part of reality. You could see it. You could see it happening. All of the organic materials, the atoms, the molecular nature, how things form together to create units, to create different forms of being, different pieces. There's something that creates a sense of family, a sense of coexistence, right? And even though there's chaos and randomness, that's there so that things can align themselves without the space, without the emptiness, without the nothingness. The lines can't align themselves, right? They can't travel and cross and make connections and send signals without space, without that empty nothingness, right? So that nothingness is like a solid being, a solidness, a uniform substance that exists everywhere. And in a sense, it ties everything together. It creates one connection with everything, with all the different pieces. It creates one connection because it's everywhere, it's uniform, it's solid, right? It creates one connection. Maybe that is the connection. The connection itself is nothing, space. You can't really define it as anything. Therefore, it exists everywhere, inside of anything that is defined, all right? It's hard to grasp that. And I've thought about it a long time, all my life, because I've been kind of traumatized by death and nothing, becoming empty, becoming non-existent, that sort of thing. And I finally have been dealing with it, understanding it, realizing that, what I am is just a product of some design, something that, I'm not really in control of. It's just happening, right? And the things that I say is just a reaction of all the things that have happened and have aligned themselves and have created a stress or anxiety inside of me that's forced me to move and act a certain way That's just a behavior, something that's put into a subconscious way of existing, right? And this consciousness on the other side is like the reaction to it, the creation of sense, the creation of being, and it's like it's just being projected. It's not like being controlled like from what you see as yourself. It's behind all that. All right, it's very difficult to really project that into other people that haven't really spent the time thinking about it or absorbed it or really felt it. It's something you have to really feel, something you have to really have affect you, like personally, right? Because most people are just walking around in a subconscious way of acting, some kind of way that they don't question, what's going on. They don't question it. They're just repeating a cycle of being that's comfortable. It doesn't create any walls or any limits that you have to try and break through. There's no feeling of being locked in and not being able to move or think about other stuff, right? So I've been kind of locked away in my own space, away from things, away from the world, away from other people, not being able to express myself the ways that I wanted to. And so in a way, I've been thrown into one of the extreme sides. You got the space and the line, the duality, and I was thrown into one extreme side and forced to see the reality of that extreme nature, the extreme nature of not being anything. I was forced to relate with that. I was forced to have relativity with that extreme side. And there's two sides, the darkness and the lightness. And they're both good, they're both bad. They're just the way they are, right? And when those two things get close together, it creates a defined sense. You have this contrast. But when they get away from each other, there's this blurring, this gradient. And it's very neutral, very gray, right? You have this gradient goes from black to white. You have all these gray values. And they're saying you have to find value in life. You have to find your value, right? Everybody exists, everybody has a value on the scale between the dark and the light. And we're constantly going back and forth between it, creating feeling, creating that friction, that texture that creates a heat, warmth. Or if there's no friction, it becomes cold and you don't feel as much, you become numb, okay? So if you spend all your time in this gray, blurriness without noticing the dark and light contrast that creates a duality, if you spend all your time in the neutral way of existing where you're not questioning, or maybe you are questioning stuff, but you're not feeling as if you're a part or a piece because your value is too gray, too blended to see it distinctly, you'll feel lost, you'll feel like nothing, you'll feel empty. You'll become relative to the nothingness, to the mysterious stuff that connects all the pieces together. And then you start awakening to the reality of that contrast, that distinctness, that truth to what identity is, what the contrast is, what the line is. The line is just a contrast between the dark and the light put together, creating this fine sense that jumps between the light and the dark. It creates this big jump that creates a feeling when you look at it, when you sense it. When texture is just, jumps between certain dimensions of space, the roughness. And with the eyes, you have the light and the dark, the texture that creates texture in the rods and cones in your eyes. And all these different forms of sensing things all rely on this duality, this jump, this texture. It all creates this friction, this heat, this universal force, energy, right? It's all a process of creating an emergence of knowing what any of this is. That's our purpose, is just to know, to sense. That's what all this is doing. It's just sensing whatever it wants to sense, whatever is there. And it's crazy. It's like a fractal of just grids, you know, vertical and horizontal lines, crossing, friction, creating a focus, creating a point in the middle. You know, all the gray neutral values are kind of an extension of the friction, creating smoke or heat. It just emerges from the duality naturally. And you could see this pattern everywhere. You could see it in all the behavior of nature and substances and things, how things dissolve in water, how water evaporates, how fire emerges when you rub sticks together, creating heat and that sort of thing. It's all repetitive, and it's all there to remind us, to waken us, to realize what is going on. We've become this advanced because we're trying to figure it out, and all of this is here to give us clues, to ways of seeing, ways of knowing the truth, knowing what this is, what you are, you know? I think maybe duality, one side knows everything, one side knows nothing, and it's constant, going through this process of knowing nothing to something, but it goes back and forth, and everything's unified. And I think when you die, it's like you're just a shell. You're just a shell. All of this is just a shell for something else to express itself through. And all this is just a creation of that. And it's pretty crazy, but it's also amazing when you grasp it, because then you're like free to just kind of realize that most of this stuff that we do is meaningless. And then it starts putting like real value, real sense of purpose in your life, because then you're like, you know, now I know, you know, my purpose is to kind of share this, you know, create more awareness for myself and also for other people. But it's difficult. It's very difficult in this sort of world that we live in, where there's so many things getting in our way with all the industrialization and the systems. We've become too rigid. You know, the structure hasn't been allowed to bend and be flexible, right? We're so focused on trying to make the line that we've forgotten sense of the space. And a lot of people out there are locked in space, and they don't have the ability to travel back and forth between the line and the space, okay? And so, like, I want to help those type of people realize how to travel between the line and space, that sort of thing, and awaken their sense of being and that sort of thing. So I'm trying different types of videos and seeing what gets a reaction, okay? I'm trying to figure out what gets a reaction, because that reaction is like a fire that kind of creates something, you know? If there's no reaction, things get cold, and they kind of just become dormant, you know? They kind of wait for something else to happen. So I don't know if any of this is going to get through to you who's watching. I don't know who's watching. Not too many people know who I am, because I came from nothing, right? I feel like nothing. I feel like I haven't become something yet. I've done a lot of things, but it doesn't give me the sense of satisfaction or a sense of that I've accomplished something amazing. I've done some things that people might consider amazing, but it's all relative. And to me, the stuff that I've done doesn't mean much. I want to do more. So you can see that pattern, grid pattern on the blades of the windmill. Creates this uniform structure of the lines. It has like a very smooth, uniform texture to it, whereas the sides of the windmill have more of an organic texture to it because the lines don't all align themselves. You know, it has that kind of brick pattern where the lines are kind of offset from each other. It makes it feel like it's a little more disturbed or a little more fuzzy. So it creates a different feeling. You can see the windows have the panes of glass in like a grid structure again. You can see those bells up there, very round, have their own kind of symbolic type of feeling to it. You got the fence structure around it. It's kind of interesting. It's also another grid, but you have this geometric kind of design with the sides, has multiple sides to the windmill, different angles. You have the brick pattern on the wall. If I could adjust that. You can see the grid. You can see the wall is a bit more organic. So you kind of have the ground that's very organic. And then you have this stone grid brick pattern that's a little less organic, has more structure to it. And then you go up and you have this other pattern that's a little less organic. And then you have this other grid that's even more straight and uniform. So there's this transition that happens from the ground into the sky, creating this contrast, this balance between the two sides. You have this grid. I don't know what this is. What's down here? There's just some water in it. I don't know if you can see that. There's a grid. It's kind of interesting. There's a bunch of little grids around it. Basically grids everywhere. You can see over here we got some more stuff. More grids. It's also interesting how these, I don't know what you would call it, but they're on these walls that have grids. Grid pieces of stone. I don't know if you could see that. This rigid structure, it's interesting how everybody likes to use these rigid structures. I guess it's easier to build stuff with it. They don't realize that all these grids are locking us into this type of cage. This cage. The good thing is that we have this natural balance that goes on between the rigidness and the fluid substance, that space that exists everywhere that's naturally making it dissolve and change itself. You know, nothing can withstand that, because you know it gets everywhere, it gets inside of everything. There's no limit to nothing. There's no limit to the emptiness. You know, it has no boundaries. You know, whereas the opposite, the line is the division. The line is that kind of limit itself. Maybe they're both the same thing, just, you know, expressed in different ways. It's a fake plant. It's interesting how we try to imitate nature, try to mimic nature. Look at this grid. There's a lot of organized patterns in nature, and I like to use the grid to create stuff. A very structured way of making things, or making things feel like they have a continuation, right? Just lines one after the other. Lines just one after the other. The grid creates this feeling of continuous being, crossing the lines again and again and again, creating that feeling, the constant reality, sense of being. Check it out. We have this structure here, this square with a bunch of lines crossing in the middle, creating this friction, this fire, this sense of life that emerges from this grid, this order, a continuation of life, okay? It's all symbolic, but you could see this pattern, this symbol reflected everywhere in the world. This is just one example. You could see the grid in the ground, in the memory. Throughout history, we have this recording of this concept between sides, between the lines and the spaces. There's no mistake to it. There's deeper meanings, and it's all there to help us understand what's going on, what's happening in reality, what is reality, you know, what is death, that sort of thing. There's no mistake. I didn't expect to see this here, but look, the same pattern with the lines crossing in the center. This is quite literally what I'm trying to express, but it's in a form that withstands the forces of nature. It's in the stone, okay? Look at it. It's a flame emerging from the center where the lines cross in a space, a square, a grid that extends everywhere, okay? Right angles, order of the space. Okay? And it's this fire that's this organic emergence of something that creates this feeling, okay? This consciousness, this being in the stillness of the grid. It's quite interesting to think about, and it's quite amazing to see it everywhere once you realize it, once you understand the concept of this duality between the lines and the spaces. You could basically read it. It's like a book. It's like this message that constantly appears everywhere in front of you. Look at it. It's on the walls. It's on the boundaries. It's on the limits. It's there reminding you of the sides. Even if there's death, there's life. And it's just this pattern, this rhythm that goes and goes and goes and never ends. It's never ending. It's a fractal. And once you realize that, part of the fear disappears. Part of the fear of the unknowingness disappears because everything begins to make sense. You know, everything has a reason for it. But that reason is a bit simpler than you realized before.